I recently moved to a small rural town, looking for a place where I could finally live a peaceful life with my animals. I had always dreamed of owning a piece of land where I could raise a few goats, chickens, and maybe even a couple of cows. The property I found was perfect, a few acres, quiet, and away from the hustle of city life. It wasn't just a house, it was a home I could share with my animals. I was excited to start this new chapter, but little did I know that my excitement would soon turn into a battle with my neighbors, and one particular woman who was about to make my life difficult. When I first arrived, everything seemed perfect. My animals were happy, the grass was green, and I had a small garden. Life was simple, and I thought I'd found my dream. However, as time passed, I started noticing that the neighbors weren't as friendly as I thought they'd be. At first, they would wave, but their smiles were a bit forced, and I could tell they didn't really like the idea of someone like me moving in, someone who wasn't exactly part of the community. But I didn't think much of it. I was focused on my animals and getting the farm up and running. Then, one day, I had a knock at my door. Standing there was a woman who introduced herself as Karen. She was in her mid-50s, with an expression that said she was about to have a serious talk. I invited her in, and she didn't waste time getting to the point. "I've been hearing complaints from the neighbors about the noise and smell coming from your property," she said, her tone sharp. "You have way too many animals here, and it's starting to affect the neighborhood." I was taken aback. "I'm just raising a few goats and chickens," I explained. "They're not causing any trouble." She didn't seem convinced. "Well, you need to get rid of them. We don't want to deal with farm animals here. This isn't the countryside." I was shocked. The town was mostly rural, with several farms nearby. But I didn't argue. I simply told her I'd think about it and that I wasn't sure I could get rid of my animals, as they were part of my life now. She left, but I had a sinking feeling in my gut. This was just the beginning of something much bigger that I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling Karen left me with, thinking maybe I was overreacting. After all, my farm was quiet, and I made sure to keep my animals well cared for. They weren't a problem for anyone. The next few weeks passed with no real issues, but every now and then, I'd see Karen watching from her window or walking past my property. She always had this disapproving look on her face, and it seemed like she was waiting for the next reason to complain. But things escalated when I began to hear rumors from some of the other neighbors. I had been friendly with a few, exchanging pleasantries whenever we bumped into each other at the local store or at town meetings, but some of them had begun to distance themselves from me. The quiet whispers in the neighborhood hinted at a growing sense of discomfort. Karen wasn't just complaining to me anymore. She was rallying the neighborhood against me, convincing people that the presence of my animals was making the whole area unhygienic and unsafe. One day, I received a letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA. It was short and to the point: "We have received numerous complaints regarding the number of farm animals on your property. Please remove them within the next 30 days or face fines and potential legal action." I was stunned. The HOA had no issue when I first moved in, and now, out of nowhere, I was being pressured to get rid of my animals. My heart raced as I realized Karen had likely been behind the complaints. I immediately called the HOA to try and explain that my animals were not a nuisance, but I got nowhere. They said they were just acting on the complaints and that if I didn't comply, there would be consequences. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't just about a neighbor disliking my animals, now the HOA was involved, and they had the power to fine me. I felt like I was being bullied for living my life the way I wanted to. I didn't want to back down. I knew my rights, and I wasn't going to let one person dictate how I lived. So, I started doing research. I read up on property laws, animal rights in rural areas, and what the HOA could and couldn't enforce. I found out that in many rural areas, there are protections for people who own livestock or farm animals. I wasn't breaking any rules, and my animals were no different than those kept by other farmers in the area. Feeling more confident, I decided to take action. I wrote a letter to the HOA, outlining my position and stating that I was fully within my legal rights to have my animals. I also reminded them that the neighborhood was in a rural area, and such activities were not only allowed but were quite common. I requested that they reconsider their stance before taking any further steps. In the meantime, Karen didn't let up. Every time I saw her, she would make snide comments about my animals or how disgusting the smell was. She even went so far as to contact the local health department, trying to make them believe my animals were somehow a public health hazard. I felt overwhelmed. But instead of backing down, I decided to stand my ground. The day the HOA sent their response, I was ready for a fight. They acknowledged my letter but still insisted I needed to remove my animals or face further action. It was clear that they were siding with Karen and the complaints, and I knew I had to escalate things further. I hired a lawyer to help me with the case. My lawyer assured me that the HOA had no grounds to force me to remove my animals, but we would need to go through the proper legal channels to prove it. It wasn't long before Karen began to escalate her tactics. She showed up at my farm one afternoon with a few of her supporters. They were holding signs that read, "No animals here," and chanting about getting rid of the farm in the neighborhood. It felt like a full-on protest. I stood on my porch, watching as they made a scene. But this time, instead of retreating, I decided to confront her directly. I walked up to Karen and calmly told her, "You can't tell me what to do with my property. I'm not breaking any laws, and I'm not going anywhere." Karen sneered, her face twisted with rage. "You don't belong here," she spat. "You're disrupting our peaceful neighborhood. We won't stop until you're gone." I didn't back down. "You don't get to decide what's peaceful for me. I'm living my dream here, and no one's going to take that from me." It was clear that nothing would satisfy Karen. She was determined to push me out, no matter what. But I was equally determined to stay. The legal battle was not easy. My lawyer filed a formal complaint with the HOA, challenging their stance. We provided evidence that my animals were not a health risk and that there were no zoning laws prohibiting the keeping of livestock. The HOA had to take everything into consideration, and after weeks of back and forth, they finally agreed to stop pursuing the matter. They issued a statement saying that they had misunderstood the situation and would not take any further action against me. Karen, however, was still furious. She called me one last time to demand that I leave the neighborhood for the good of the community. I told her, once again, that I wasn't going anywhere. That was the last time I heard from her. The rest of the neighborhood slowly began to accept that I wasn't going to be intimidated. The protest signs disappeared, and Karen eventually moved away. It was a strange relief. I learned a lot from the experience, not just about property rights, but about standing up for myself and what I believe in. My animals are still happily roaming around, and the farm is thriving. Karen may have tried to ban my animals and kick me out, but in the end, I proved that I have the right to live the life I choose, no matter what anyone else thinks. After the HOA backed down, I thought the drama was over. But Karen's anger didn't fade. Over the next few months, I received random visits from her, sometimes just standing at the edge of my property, glaring at me. I wasn't sure if she was still plotting something or if she was simply watching to see if I'd slip up. But I wasn't about to let her dictate my life. One day, a neighbor I had become friends with, Sarah, came over to talk. "I don't know if you've heard," she began, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "But Karen's been trying to stir things up again. She's been talking to other neighbors, telling them that you're breaking zoning laws and that you'll be kicked out if you don't take the animals off your property." I sighed. It wasn't the first time I'd heard rumors. "Sarah, I've already been through this. Karen's just trying to cause trouble. The HOA's already backed down, and I'm doing everything legally." She can't do anything else. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then lowered her voice. I believe you, but just be careful. I heard that Karen's been contacting a lawyer again, trying to find any way to get you to leave. I wasn't surprised. Karen didn't seem like someone who would give up easily. I appreciated Sarah's warning, but I wasn't going to live in fear. I knew I was in the right. The law was on my side, and my farm was here to stay. It wasn't long before things took another turn. One evening, I received a letter, but this time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was from a local zoning commission, stating that they were conducting a review of my property due to multiple complaints from the community. I nearly choked on my coffee. There it was again. Karen was stirring the pot, getting other neighbors involved and trying to push me out. It was clear that she was using her influence to escalate things to another level. I immediately called my lawyer. This is ridiculous, I said. Now we've got the zoning commission involved, and I'm starting to get the feeling Karen is behind all of this. My lawyer agreed, but he reassured me that it wasn't uncommon for people like Karen to resort to these kinds of tactics. They can review your property all they want, he said. But as long as you're following the laws, there's nothing they can do. I decided to meet with the zoning commission, bringing all of my documents, maps, and proof that I was legally allowed to keep my animals. I wasn't going to let Karen's tactics scare me into silence. I knew this was going to be another fight, but it was a fight I was ready for. When the meeting with the zoning commission finally came, I walked into the room with a calm and confident demeanor. The members were sitting at a long table, looking over documents and whispering to each other. Karen wasn't there, but I could sense her presence in the room. It was almost as if she had orchestrated the whole thing from behind the scenes. I was the only one standing up for my rights. I began by explaining my situation, giving a brief history of how I moved to the property, raised my animals, and how Karen and a few others had started complaining without any real justification. I made sure to emphasize that my farm was a legal, functioning property, and that I was doing everything by the book. I had the paperwork to back it up, zoning laws, property maps, and even photos showing that my animals were well cared for and not causing any problems. As I spoke, I could see the zoning commissioners starting to nod along. They were listening, and I knew I was making my case. When I finished, one of the members turned to me and said, "We understand your concerns. We've reviewed the paperwork, and there doesn't seem to be anything wrong here. We'll take a final vote, but based on what we've seen, we don't believe there's any cause to remove your animals." I couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. It felt like a small victory, but one I wasn't willing to take for granted. The commissioners voted, and just as I expected, they decided to dismiss the complaints. I was officially cleared of any zoning violations. Karen had failed again. But that wasn't the end of the saga. As I walked out of the meeting room, I noticed a few of the neighbors who had been quietly watching the proceedings. I overheard one of them saying, "I never thought I'd see the day when Karen was proven wrong. It's nice to have someone stand up for what's right." It was a bittersweet moment for me. While I had won, I knew that Karen wasn't going to stop. The fact that she had dragged me through 2 legal battles already made it clear that she wouldn't back down. But as long as I had the law on my side and the support of a few good neighbors, I knew I would be okay. The next few weeks were quieter. Karen's name stopped coming up in the neighborhood gossip, and I began to feel a sense of normalcy return. My animals were thriving, and I felt at peace. No more surprise visits, no more threats from the HOA or zoning commission. I had stood my ground, and the community had begun to realize that I wasn't the villain Karen made me out to be. Eventually, Karen moved away. I'm not sure where she went, but I knew I wouldn't miss her. The neighborhood had settled into a calm routine once again, and I could focus on what really mattered: my animals, my farm, and my life. Looking back on everything, I realize how much this experience taught me. It wasn't just about property rights or zoning laws. It was about standing up for myself and the things that mattered to me. It was about not letting one person or a group of people dictate how I lived my life. And in the end, it was about finding peace in knowing that I had fought for what was right. And that I had won. As time passed, life on my farm returned to a sense of normalcy. My animals were still thriving, my garden was flourishing, and I felt more at peace than I had in a long time. The quiet mornings spent with my goats and chickens, watching them roam freely, felt like the reward for everything I had fought for. The stress of dealing with Karen and the HOA slowly faded into the background, and I began to focus more on enjoying the simple pleasures of rural life. I still had occasional run-ins with some of the neighbors, but the dynamic had shifted. The majority of them, who had once kept their distance, now greeted me with genuine smiles. I could tell they had seen what had happened, and they knew I wasn't the problem. They respected the fact that I had stood up for my rights and didn't back down, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against me. In a small town like ours, reputation meant everything, and I had earned mine by being someone who didn't let bullies push me around. Every now and then, I'd run into Sarah, the neighbor who had warned me about Karen's attempts to escalate things. She often asked how things were going and told me how pleased she was that I had fought back. It seemed like word had spread in the neighborhood about Karen's failure, and many people quietly applauded my stance. It wasn't about a battle won or lost anymore, it was about respect. But not everything was completely peaceful. Occasionally, someone would ask me about the situation, curious neighbors who had heard the rumors or had seen the protests that Karen organized. They often asked how I managed to stay calm during the entire ordeal, how I had the strength to stand up to Karen and the HOA. I didn't mind talking about it. In fact, I was happy to share my experience, not because I wanted to boast, but because I hoped it might encourage someone else in a similar situation. It became clear to me that standing up for yourself wasn't just about being right. It was about knowing your worth and having the courage to fight for it. One afternoon, as I was finishing up some work around the farm, a letter arrived. It wasn't from the HOA or the zoning commission, it was a letter from Karen. My heart skipped a beat as I ripped open the envelope, wondering what she could possibly want now. To my surprise, the letter wasn't what I expected. It was an apology. "I know I made your life difficult," the letter began. Looking back on everything, I realized that I overstepped. "I'm sorry for the trouble I caused you, and for putting the community against you. I was wrong, and I should have handled things differently." I couldn't believe it. After everything, Karen was apologizing? The same woman who had once tried to force me off my property, who had threatened to have me fined, and who had dragged me into endless legal battles, was admitting that she was wrong. I sat down in the chair on my porch, holding the letter in my hands, unsure of how to feel. It wasn't forgiveness that I immediately felt, it was a sense of closure. The storm that had once loomed over me was finally over, and I had come out of it stronger. I had learned that standing firm didn't just mean winning, it meant having the resilience to keep moving forward, no matter the odds. A few days later, Sarah called me. "Did you get that letter from Karen?" she asked. I told her I had, and she couldn't hide her disbelief. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said with a laugh. "Maybe this will finally put an end to her antics." While I wasn't sure if this was the end of Karen's influence on the neighborhood, it felt like a victory. The fact that she had admitted her mistakes was a step forward, and it showed that, at the end of the day, persistence and doing what's right could lead to the resolution of even the most difficult conflicts. From that point on, the community seemed to settle back into its rhythm. The old tension that had hung in the air was gone, and I felt more accepted than ever. I continued to raise my animals and live my life peacefully, knowing that I had fought for my right to do so. The farm was more than just a piece of land to me now. It was a symbol of my perseverance and the value of standing up for what I believe in. Karen's departure from the community was a reminder that some battles, no matter how exhausting, are worth fighting. It was a journey of growth, not just for me, but for the neighborhood as well. As for Karen, I never saw her again. She moved away, and I can only assume she learned something along the way. But as for me, I had the peace I had longed for. My animals continued to graze the fields, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that no one could take my dreams from me, not Karen, not the HOA, and not anyone else. And as I watched the sun set behind the rolling hills of my farm, I realized that the battle for my property wasn't just about keeping animals. It was about something bigger, the right to live life on my own terms, and the courage to defend that right when necessary. That was a lesson I would never forget. As the months passed, the quiet of my farm became a reminder of everything I had overcome. The fields were as green as ever, the animals content and thriving, and the sense of peace I had longed for when I first moved here had finally settled in. The fight with Karen, the HOA, and the zoning commission had been tough, but it had also been transformative. It taught me about my rights, about standing up for myself, and most importantly, about never letting others control my life. The neighbors who had once been unsure of me now waved with genuine smiles, and I could tell they had come to respect my decision to fight for what was right. Some even stopped by occasionally, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to chat about farm life, animals, and the occasional storm that blew through. It was a far cry from the tension-filled days when Karen had tried to rally them against me. Karen's apology, though surprising, provided a sense of closure. It was a humbling reminder that sometimes, people do come to realize their mistakes, even if it takes time. I didn't know if she had changed for good, but I did know that the drama had ended, and I could finally live my life in peace without the constant fear of someone trying to push me out. The battle had been long, but it had taught me the true value of perseverance. I didn't just fight for my animals, I fought for my freedom, my dreams, and my right to live authentically. In the end, I was not just the victor in a legal battle, I was someone who had stood up for what mattered and emerged stronger. Looking out across the land that I had fought so hard to keep, I realized that sometimes, the real victory isn't just about winning a fight, it's about finding peace within yourself and in the life you've built. I had my farm, my animals, and the life I had always dreamed of. And no one could take that away from me. As I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I knew that I had truly won. Not just the legal battles, but the life I wanted. And in that moment, everything felt just right.